Good afternoon, good morning, or evening, depending on where you're joining us today. Welcome to the webinar, Holding Sacred Space, Mental Health and Climate Change. This is the third webinar in the series, Holding Sacred Space, Mental Health and Faith. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as a Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement here at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. For participants who are blind or low vision, or perhaps are only listening, I'm a Korean American woman with long black hair tied back, wearing a navy shirt under a beige sweater. I will be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Reverend Dr. Camille Henderson Edwards, the Director of Economic Health and Gender Justice, and Toyomi Yoshida, who is our tech support. As we begin our webinar series, we want to acknowledge that where the United Methodist Building is located in Washington, D.C., is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Anacostan peoples who lived for generations next to the Pamunkey and the Piscataway people. We gratefully acknowledge and honor the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather and the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. A short overview of our time together. After the presentation, there will be a time of Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. And after the Q&A, Reverend Camille Henderson Edwards will share ways that you can get involved legislatively to be an advocate for mental health. Today, I am honored to introduce you to our speakers. Dr. Janet Lewis is the co-founder of the nonprofit Climate Psychiatry Alliance and co-chair of the Climate Committee Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry think tank and assistant clinical professor at the University of Rochester. She is an author of numerous peer-reviewed climate mental health publications and gives many presentations on climate mental health professional, community, and religious groups. These include a climate change and mental health seminar series for psychiatric residents at the University of Rochester and as faculty of climate-aware therapist trainings nationally. She lives in the Finger Lakes region of central New York State amongst much woodland and wildlife with her husband, dog, and cat, and she has 2 grown children. Sherwin Shabdar, pronounced they, them, is a 4th-year medical student at Western Michigan School of Medicine. They are currently applying for a psychiatry residency and enjoy making music in their spare time. Thank you so much for the both of you for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm working to start my video there. There it is. Okay. Screen share my slides. Okay, so we are so pleased to be here today. I know that the Methodist Church. Are you still seeing just my slides here?
We can currently see your notes as well.
Oh, okay. I went into the wrong one. Let me get out and go back in. Okay. We know that the Methodist Church has really been out front in concerns about social justice and climate change in that regard. And so we're particularly pleased to be speaking as part of this here today. I will both start out telling you a little bit about ourselves. We're both in the field of psychiatry. I had something of an awakening several years ago about climate change when I was at a spiritually oriented conference. And there was discussion about climate change, and the information just penetrated for me. And I had a lot of clarity that this was one of the most important things happening, and I had to work on it. And that also gave me a lot of interest in what helps this information sink in for people. And a lot of my teaching within psychiatry and in groups of therapists has been about how to contain this difficult information. Sherwin, do you want to say something about how you came to this?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sherwin. I'm a fourth year medical student. I'm off in Michigan right now. I I think climate change and climate justice was important to me as a youth, especially. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and yeah, it was a big topic there, especially with like, the amount of natural beauty I grew around. And then I kind of lost track of things for a while. Climate change was still an issue that was important to me, but I wasn't that involved in advocacy through college. But then I chanced upon a seminar in medical school about what medical folks can do about climate change as community leaders, as advocates. And I was recommended through that to Climate Psychiatry Alliance and, found a wonderful community there. And yeah, learned a lot, grown a lot. And yeah, I'm excited to be here sharing with y'all today.
Okay, all right. So I wanted to mention Catherine Cahoe to everybody. She is a climate scientist who also identifies as an evangelical Christian. And here's a quote from her. She says, "For Christians, doing something about climate change is about living our faith, caring for those who need help, our neighbors here at home or on the other side of the world, and taking responsibility for this planet that God created and entrusted to us." I know that the Methodist Church sponsoring this webinar is very much aligned with these views. We'll be covering several things today. Our overall goal is to contribute to ongoing building of a shared climate-aware and involved faith community. And we'll be describing climate change, describing the mental health effects, talking about what gets called eco-distress, and talking about validation and normalization of the wide range of emotions that come up in dealing with climate change, and also talking about coping skills and moving forward. So first, climate change. This is a picture from NASA of the Earth's atmosphere. As we stand here on the Earth and look up, it looks as though the sky goes on forever, but that's actually an illusion. The atmosphere, by some measures, is only 61 miles thick. So if you could drive a car straight up at 65 miles an hour, you'd be outside the atmosphere in less than an hour. And because it's so thin, human activity has been easily able to influence it. This is a scary graph. Most of you have probably seen some version of it. This one is from NASA. It's based on data from bubbles of air held in Antarctic ice cores, where the ice has been drilled down into this ancient ice. This ancient ice has been brought up, and the little bubbles of air in it have been analyzed. And looking at the levels of CO2 in that air, it's been determined what the course of atmospheric CO2 levels has been over the past 800,000 years. So this graph is going back 800,000 years. As a point of reference, Homo sapiens are thought to have been here for about 300,000 years. So this graph goes back almost 3 times as far as we've been here as Homo sapiens. And as you can see, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up and down and up and down and up and down with natural cycles until recent decades when it's going up and up. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps the solar radiation as the solar radiation is trying to bounce back off the Earth. So this is a scary graph. Even if we've seen this many times, we can all kind of take a breath in taking in this information. It can be difficult. CO2, along with methane and some other gases, trap this solar radiation. Methane, molecule for molecule, is actually a more potent greenhouse gas, better at trapping the heat, but there's more carbon dioxide. So that's why you'll hear mainly about carbon dioxide. And adding to this very concerning situation are the long residence times of these gases in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for varying lengths of time, depending on conditions, but usually for decades. Methane stays in the atmosphere for 12 years. So future worsening of effects is already baked into the system. And adding even further to our predicament are feedback loops that can accelerate the warming effects, such as the loss of the albedo effect of ice from the melting ice, where more heat is getting absorbed by the dark ocean than the white ice, and also the melting of the permafrost releasing methane. Now, you'll hear that many countries are reducing their emissions. More than 20 countries have reduced their rates of emission. And this is fantastic news. But when emissions are not yet net zero, still the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up because of those long residence times, because it stays there so long. This can be a confusing point. The rates of emissions are decreasing, but the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is still going up. And most of these emissions are from the burning of fossil fuels. Animal agriculture is also a large contributor. Many of the consequences of global warming are quite tragic. This has been largely because not only is the Earth warming, but it has destabilized the climate system as a whole. So we're having and are predicted to have more disasters, more intense storms, wildfires, flooding, heat waves, drought, sea level rise, forced migrations, loss of communities and entire homelands for some people, loss of other species. We're in what's been called the sixth mass extinction. And what's expected is also more food insecurity, greater ranges of some infectious diseases, worsening of harmful algal blooms, the acidification of the ocean, which is hurting many of the ocean ecosystems, and heat itself can have psychological effects. Heat is associated with higher incidence of violence and of suicide. I think we all have had the experience when we're overheated, feeling grouchy. So heat itself has direct psychological effects. And all of these things contribute to geopolitical conflict, as there are issues with resources and land. And also we have trauma and anticipated and repeated traumas and chronic stress. And wherever we have trauma, we get concerned about the transgenerational transmission of trauma, where the children of traumatized parents are themselves quite vulnerable to having been affected, but for various reasons. So with all of these effects of climate change, we do probably really need to breathe here again. A useful way for us to reframe all of this, in therapy, we talk about reframes, working to look at something in a different way. A useful way for us to reframe all of this tragedy in our minds is that there's plenty of important work to do. So how lucky are we to be here at such a time? But here is more bad news. There are tremendous climate injustices. The populations that are most vulnerable tend to experience climate impacts first and worst. There's disproportionate impacts worldwide, where many of the regions that have been least responsible for the emissions are feeling the brunt of the climate change effects. And here in the United States, low-income and BIPOC communities, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color, these communities, which are already often quite disadvantaged, are even more vulnerable to these effects, both by virtue of their locations and by virtue of difficulty having resources. The mentally ill and the otherwise disabled are also particularly vulnerable to disasters and other mental health effects of climate change. And there's tremendous generational injustice. Children are particularly vulnerable, both because of their physiology, they're developing, and they're particularly vulnerable to heat. They're particularly vulnerable to many kinds of diseases related to climate change. But they're also vulnerable because they're dependent on adults. And if the adults are traumatized, that's going to affect the children. And then the other aspect of generational injustice is that the younger people are going to be experiencing much more of the climate change effects in the future. So any efforts that help with injustices generally, or that support the kind of social cohesion that helps people with resources, any of those things contribute to the cause of climate justice. I love the title of this conference, Holding Sacred Space, because there is important space to be held right now. And understanding it as sacred helps us to do that, helps us to hold it, to not turn away. We can feel supported in an ability to be here, even when being here is not easy. Here's a quote from the environmental reporter David Wallace Wells from a piece he wrote last year. He said, "For me, the last few years provide arguments both for buoyant optimism and abject despair." The buoyant optimism part, of course, is, as I said, over 20 countries are reducing their rates of emission, and that actually has moved the needle a bit in the projections. But those are so many people working so hard, and that's just wonderful. That's beautiful. And then at the same time, there's so much suffering and tragedy now, and there's anticipated to be more. And so both these things have to be held at the same time. It takes quite a bit of space to hold both of these things at the same time. And the other cause for the abject despair, of course, is that our response thus far has been inadequate. And when I say our response, I'm speaking for the parts of humanity, like most of us, who would have the most influence. Even with support, we're human. So what are the mental health effects of climate change for us? Please reflect as we're talking here today. Where are you at emotionally with climate change? For those of you who are clergy or in other helping professions, teachers or parents, or in helping roles of any kind, it's especially important to be doing this reflection oneself in order to be available to others. We sort of have to put on our own oxygen mask first. So please reflect on this, on where you are at emotionally with climate change as we go through the presentation here today. And Sherwin, did you want me to get out, or did you want?
No, if you want to just.
I'll advance. Okay.
Yeah. So this begins some of the more didactic part of the presentation. So we first want to talk about eco-emotions, which is just a term for the range of emotional responses that people experience living in a world confronted by climate crisis. And we're going to, of course, focus on some of the more painful ones, but there is a wide range of emotions. It's including, grief, anxiety, solastalgia, and many others that we're going to get into shortly. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a word called paper by Coffey and Yumeko, called Understanding Eco-Anxiety. These are just different terms used from a scoping review of the literature about climate-related emotions, and there are a lot of them. Some are emotions that we use in daily life, like anger or dread or grief, but many others are more specified. Eco-anger and eco-anxiety both come up a lot as eco-guilt. Solastalgia, which we're going to define more closely in a moment, but is a combination of solace and nostalgia. And then climate trauma. These emotions can be experienced both in acute events, such as with acute weather events, but also in the long term, experiencing a long-term slow-moving crisis in one's lifetime. Next slide. Yeah, so eco-distress syndromes are sort of different shapes of emotions that people can experience due to climate change. So climate grief is one of the more common ones, is grieving, grieving that living in a tragedy and one's powerlessness to stop it. Pre-traumatic stress disorder, not because of the post-traumatic stress disorder, is, sort of the flash forwarding, that those visions of the future, that fear and stress from what might happen in the future. Climate anxiety and eco-anxiety are, much like general anxiety, but focused on a particular topic, or on climate change, that sort of constant vigilance of what one can do or what might happen. Solastalgia, again, the combination of solace or nostalgia, which is actually, I didn't realize that was what it meant for quite a long time. I thought it was solar, like solar. But so solastalgia is a longing for a place of peace or of comfort that may no longer exist. So a common example is when someone has a close tie to a natural area that is no longer the way it was in their, that provided solace due to climate change or due to ecological changes. And then there's existential risk and distress for the fear of a changing planet. And these can all be manifested through different emotional defenses. Denial is a common one, especially in this work. Folks who want to, for the sake of their own mental state, minimize the impacts or deny that climate change is happening because the alternative is too frightening. Bargaining is another defense, and so on. Next slide, please. It's important to note, and I'm going to say this more than once at least, that eco-distress is not necessarily pathological. To quote the quote from Jiddu Krishnamurti is that it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Or in other words, this is very frightening. This is, an ongoing crisis. If this isn't I'm of concern, I would, ask you to revisit the science. But in and of itself, eco-distress is not inherently pathological. What we do want to talk about, though, is when it becomes pathological. Next slide, please. So these are specifically red flags for eco-anxiety, but they do more broadly apply to other eco-emotions. So again, what we're trying to define here is the line between sort of a healthy amount of distress as a motivator and an amount of distress that interferes. So unregulated and overwhelming states of profound anxiety, worry, or depression, obsessive thoughts about climate disaster, oscillating between states of numbness and being overwhelmed, which can kind of tie into those coping mechanisms like denial again, but just a general moving back and forth between, numbness to the crisis and just too much pain. And lastly, when this interferes with daily functioning and quality of life. And these are sort of the red flags when we begin thinking of these as clinical syndromes, as things that need addressing in the individual level, because it is, again, it's worthwhile and natural and human to feel an amount of distress and anger and sadness about climate change, but at the point where it begins interfering with one's daily life is the point where we start to worry about it. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is a visual example of solastalgia, which is defined as distress when environment no longer affords the same solace. And this is, this example of a forest, which I'm not 100% satisfied with it because, this might have been a forest fire, which can be part of the forest's healing process. I'm not entirely certain the context of the image, but the general idea comes across that a place that was once a home and a solace and a refuge is lost, and that is a really particular kind of grief and sadness, that loss that something may never come back to the way it was before. And if you want to take a second and think about places that might have the same meaning to you, either now or in the future, and how they might be under threat, just take a moment to think about that. Yeah, thank you. For me, I think of the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge near where I grew up, which thankfully is still very well taken care of, but it is near the Puget Sound. It is still liable to be affected by climate change, and it's a wildlife refuge in part because the ecosystem there is so tenuous at times. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a survey in young people about climate change in Lancet, and we do talk a lot about in climate change and psychiatry about young people because they're often the population that is most hurting or most notable, and in part because they will have to live with the consequences of climate change for the longest. But in this case, we're looking at them in part as a window into coping. So of 10,000 youth in 10 countries in this survey, 84% were at least moderately concerned. 45% had these feelings affect daily life and functioning. 75% think the future is frightening. 83% think people have failed to take care of the planet. And this is often perceived to be due to an inadequate government response. Whether a common conversation with young people is just, the simple one of, do you want to have children? And a lot of people in this age group, around my age even, don't, simply because the thought of bringing a child into this kind of ongoing disaster seems more harm than it's worth. And it's a strange emotional thing to think of yourself as the end of that line, or to think of the world as too harmful to consider perpetuating in that way. And it can have some pretty profound impacts on people. Next slide, please. So this one is a more broad population. This was a study, a survey by Yale and George Mason University, sort of arranging people's concern levels about climate change. So 26% alarmed, 27% concerned, and so on. And this actually was honestly pleasantly surprised to me, just that it's more than half of people in the United States that do have either considered themselves alarmed or concerned about global warming, and only 11% would call themselves dismissive, or another 11% doubtful. I think it's worth reminding oneself that this is not quite the wedge issue it was 10 or 15 years ago, that there is a broader consensus that this is happening, especially if the evidence becomes harder and harder to ignore. Next slide, please. So this is a paper by Maria Ohala about how children cope with global climate change. And again, we talk about this in part because, the importance of caring for children, but also in part because these strategies are seen in adults and applicable to adults. Not to accuse adults of being tall children, but in a lot of senses we are. So the three sort of forms of coping that this paper looked at, they divided into problem-focused, meaning-focused, and de-emphasizing the threat. De-emphasizing the threat would be the denial sort of thing that we discussed earlier, that, minimizing, de-emphasizing, ignoring if possible, pushing it to the back of your mind. Problem-focused coping is more of the fixating on the problem, of like writing out the challenges and thinking over the problems and what might happen in the future, almost obsessively. And then meaning focused is the sort of coping where you focus on what you can do to help, and what you can, and what your limitations are, your community, but as well as the problem itself. And this was the coping mechanism they found that was the most effective. So in these children, as you can sort of guess, children who de-emphasized the threat were less engaged with climate change and health activism than those who exhibited problem-focused or meaning-focused coping, but also affect, so general sort of mood. Children who practiced meaning-focused coping didn't have the negative affect, the negative mood impacts that problem-focused children did, because they were the ones who were able to channel this grief and this pain into directions that were helpful without letting it having to sit inside them and build up. And this paper is from 2012, but I do find it's still relevant today. Next slide, please. So a little bit more meaning-focused coping. So this is the definition of the paper. It's drawing on the beliefs, values, and existential goals to evoke positive feelings that can help them bear the worry associated with the threat of climate change without having to minimize or deny its reality. And I want to share a story I heard from a member of the Climate Psych Alliance. His name is Ajay, who talked about going on a boat trip with other young people interested in climate change and climate advocates to the Arctic ice and seeing a glacier collapse, which was terrifying and deeply tragic. But also he said that he found a lot of comfort in experiencing that with community, with other people who were as concerned and as passionate as motivated. And ultimately, although it was also a very real example of the way that climate change affected him, he also found that it was, powerful and in some sense invigorating. With repeated validation of the legitimacy of eco-anxious feelings, you learn not to banish them, but to live with and ideally channel them. And this is, an example that is present in a lot of psychology and psychiatry, but it's maybe especially relevant here, that when one banishes thoughts, tries to push them to the back of your mind, just gets, it gets cluttered up. It becomes harder and harder to do so. You learn instead to face these feelings and accept them, and accept where they're coming from and why they are there, and be in dialogue with these emotions and this anxiety, and channel them if you can into action. If anxiety is your brain's signal of I need to do something about this, then sometimes it's okay to listen to that signal and say, well, what can I do about this? And also, what can't I? And this is a problem that's too big for me to fix on my own, but what things can I do? And then the last example of this adaptation is reframing it as I mentioned the example, as an experience of profound empathy. That these emotions are a sign that you care for others, that you care for the world you live in. And that is in itself a beautiful thing. And, important to cherish. As painful as these emotions are, they're also a lot better than the alternative of being numb to it. Next slide, please. So this is taken from, I believe, the Adaptive Mind PowerPoint set. This is just a single slide takeout, but it's lovely presentation for future. But this looked at sort of different kinds of hope on a scale from passive optimism to active transformative hope. And I did want to go through these. So because, just hoping is not enough. Where passive optimism is that I'm sure things will work out in the end somehow, that Pollyanna hope. The active optimism or the heroic hope is that I alone will fix this. I will change the world. And it can be a lot to put on oneself. It can be, quite massive. Passive skepticism or stoic hope is that sort of maybe a realistic acceptance that you can't save the whole thing, but a skepticism that anyone can do anything and maybe it's better not to engage. Active skepticism being that grounded hope that this is a big challenge and I'm aware of the size of the problem and so things, but perhaps there's a chance for change. And then the last step is that active transformation of radical hope, that belief that, well, something must happen and something can happen and I will be part of that change in whatever ways I can find. And that's sort of the process we want people to try to move toward. That's the end goal of this. Although, it's a process. There are all sorts of stages. Next slide, please. And also, and I've sort of touched on this, but it's important. This is from Dr. Cooper, the picture, who is director of Climate Psychiatry Alliance and a big believer in pictures of children's holding signs. That not all feelings are negative, that, there is hope finding and joy and possibility, even in a crisis. There's connection and community, both communities of faith and communities of action. There is shared engagement and solidarity. There's a sense of purpose, agency, and empowerment. There's meaning and connection and joy and pride and all these positive things that can be found in this sort of mobilizing action. I read recently C.S. Lewis's arguments on the existence of pain, which is worth reading for anyone who's interested in faith and exploring it. But one of his core arguments is, and I apologize to Dr. Lewis, whose books I love very much if I'm not quite quoting this right, but that pain exists in part to galvanize us, that it exists in the world because it's how we express our goodness, and it gives us an opportunity to be the best versions of ourselves. That if everything was easy and simple, there would be no need to be moral. Next slide, please. So this is a guide from the Climate Psychiatry Alliance toolkit. The link is on the side, and it will send out or put in the chat at the end of this a list of resources that we've collected as well. And I'm so sad I have to split this in half because it does not fit on a single PowerPoint slide. But these are some coping mechanisms for changing with the changing climate. The C is just learning to calm oneself. The L is leaning on support systems, including friends, family, religious beliefs, support groups, mental health. I is an acknowledgement that it's okay to feel what you feel, that you're not alone in this feeling. M is managing media exposure, and if I have to recommend one of these, this might be the one. It is okay, and it's important to stay informed, and it's also important not to overdo it and just find yourself doom scrolling or passively taking in painful things because the pain has become a habit. It's again important to strike a balance between tuning everything out and overwhelming oneself. A is for advocacy for action and solutions. T is for taking a deep breath or a walk, and especially I wanted to highlight here, connecting with the natural world around you, in whatever form that takes, whether it's a walk in the park or going to a stream or going out in the water or whatever form of, going into the desert if you're in the desert, whatever form of nature is around you, connecting with why you feel things and what you want. And E is embracing hope and validating positive emotions, enjoying and protecting the earth, and taking time to engage with the calming and restorative aspects of nature. There's a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a lovely book. It's by an Indigenous woman who is also a biologist and talks about the interplay of those two practices. But there's an anecdote where she's giving a talk to a group of graduate students, and she asks them, and they're graduate students in plant biology, and she asks them if they love the earth and the natural world, and they say, of course, and they list all sorts of examples and thoughts and ideas, and then she asks them, does the earth love you back? And there's just this awkward silence, and she says to them, well, of course the earth loves you back. Of course the earth loves you back. It keeps you sheltered from the sun and provides you with water and shelter and plants and animals and all these things. There's the earth, and however you conceptualize the earth being loves you too. And that's, part of this. That's part of why these emotions are the way they are. Next slide, please. So this is a very large slide that we're not going to spend too much time on because it's from a much larger set of presentation about transformational resilience, which is, again, highly worth looking into. But this is just, I wanted to look at the way people's supports are laid out. Because often when facing climate crisis, things can be very overwhelming to face oneself. And that's why it's important that you don't just face things yourself. There's your personal skills, your own self-calming mechanisms, your habits, your exercise, and your eating well. But then there are internal supports as well, internalized ideas of others, of role models, of mentors, that can bring you calm. Social supports, family and friends, external supports, places, physical places, things you can build, ecological supports, the sun, the earth, the water you bring. And also, and this isn't in this, but also, faith exists in all sorts of these supports, both internal, external, and ecological, and is worth finding there. Next slide, please.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sherwin. With wrapping up here, as I said, the Methodists have been way out front in working on a lot of this. There are also a whole host of Christian climate organizations in existence. This is just some of them, Christian and other faith-based climate organizations. Meaning-focused coping, as was being said, relies on our basic drive for meaning, and it taps our sources of ultimate meaning. It's what helps us to be with things that are difficult. And all sources of meaning have to do with our experiencing ourselves as part of something larger. And so, of course, faith communities are doing tremendous work. I wanted to mention here again, Katharine Hayhoe. The discussions about climate change have become very polarized, and different people think in different ways about our relationship with the earth. But as she says, a thermometer is not liberal or conservative. Climate change is something that we all have to deal with, and we all have some responsibilities in interfacing with and doing things about. I was once in a training about climate communication, and the professor who was running the training played a video of Katharine Hayhoe, and the professor said, "Do it like that. Talk about climate the way Katharine Hayhoe does." And I thought to myself, she's a religious Christian. I mean, the way she's doing this does not come out of nowhere. So having a deep basis in faith is such a wonderful foundation to be engaging with these climate issues and other justice issues. And here's a picture off of the United Methodist website. And it's from a 2016 United Methodist General Conference in Portland, Oregon. Here, folks are holding signs about the struggle for clean water around the world. And the video was sponsored by the United Methodist Women. The picture's by Paul Jeffrey. So again, we're just so honored to be here as part of this webinar, and we want to make you aware of these resources. The Climate Psychiatry Alliance website has a lot of resources, as do the websites of the Climate Psychology Alliances, and there are other resources here, documentaries, readings, that you can access. So it takes a village, and we have gratitude to the community we have at Climate Psychiatry Alliance. It is so important to find other people. When I first got involved in this, one of the first things I did was to find like-minded colleagues. And that is just so important because there is solidarity, there's power and creativity at the level of groups that doesn't exist at the level of individuals. An individual can easily think, what am I going to do, little me? But in doing things with others, There's so much that can be done and that is being done. So we now have time for questions. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis and Sherwin, for the presentation. I feel like some of the questions that were kind of coming in through the other kind of chat option, you kind of already addressed some of them, but perhaps we can go in a little bit deeper. And for those that are watching right now, feel free to submit your questions. So one of the questions, what are some ways to help children or tall children become more become active, active hope? How do we cultivate that?
Yeah.
Well, okay, do
Go
you want
ahead.
to?
Actually,
Children, it's important to recognize that children both are at their own developmental levels, and they of course are hearing things about what's happening, and so it's important to find out what a child knows before just assuming things about what their concerns might be. Children really need to see the adults around them and their communities active in working on this, so that they're not feeling alone with it. And those kinds of meaning focused coping are things that can be modeled by adults, that you can lean on belief systems, and you can think about things in reframed ways that look at the positive aspects of something, and you can be involved.
yeah, very much, very well said. I was actually also going to note we have compiled a list of resources, organizations, and documentaries and so on to share them. I'm just going to put in the chat now, and if it can be sent out afterwards, that'd be lovely also. There we are. Yeah, and I think one way is for helping children and tall children is just finding those ways to be involved, whether it's through organizations or whether it's through other ways of engaging, but having those conversations, taking the feelings seriously, and treating that with those emotions with respect and kindness, and helping them channel that into a way that feels helpful for them, and making that a conversation.
Thank you so much for both of your responses. So another question, a lot of those that are participating in this webinar right now will be watching later are part of faith communities throughout, and some of them are clergy, those serving as pastors, and some of them are lay people. And these communities kind of function also as supportive circles. And so a question is, what can faith communities do that's perhaps unique in mitigating anxieties around climate change, and help curate the supportive support circles as mentioned in one of the slides? How do we go about doing that?
Well, there are various ways that we contain our climate anxiety. And one way is relational, is the solidarity. And so faith communities that continue to welcome people in, that's one thing faith communities can do to be an even greater resource for the other communities that they are in. The kinds of narratives that exist in traditions can also be very helpful. Thinking about the time we are in, we're in a tumultuous time that's likely to get more tumultuous. That's quite clear. And the faith traditions have stories that people can identify with in useful ways. Thinking about this like the Hebrews' time in the desert, like Jesus's time in the desert. These are useful stories for people to be able to identify with, in order to be able to be with the time that we're in now. And it can also, this message can be amplified by faith communities that meaning having sources of meaning is a big part of what helps us to be in situations like this and to remain engaged in situations like this. So I think there are unique ways that faith communities can help. Also, there's a voice of authority that religious leaders have that they can continue to be using in advocacy, in lobbying all of our government organizations, in making their voices known to industries that are polluting. That the religious community is seeing this and finds it not acceptable. There's particular authority in the kind of advocacy that can be done. I appreciate that question very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to progress to our next session part of this webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Lewis and Sherwin, for the presentation. So we educate to advocate, and I'm really thankful for my colleague, Reverend Camille Henderson-Edwards, being here to kind of share how we can get involved legislatively today. Thanks, Camille.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lewis. I believe that your comments about carrying a specific level of authority in this conversation, I think, is a perfect segue. I do find that has been our experience, especially with expressing our priorities on the Hill, and not just myself in this role, but United Methodists who are advocating and doing this work around climate change, doing this work also around different mental health pieces of legislation relating to mental health. So for all who are gathered, we do have a QR code that you can access. We can put that on the screen if you would. So we do currently have 2 pieces of legislation that we are working on. I shared in previous webinars that we initially have the Better Mental Health Care for Americans Act, that Church and Society, the General Board of Church and Society, has endorsed. You should have received an action alert for that, shared in the previous webinar. And then another action alert came out this morning for the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act. This piece of legislation has been sponsored by Representatives Paul Tonko and Bob Ryan in the House, Senator Edward Markey in the Senate. The premise of this bill is to address the mental health crisis as it relates to mental health due to climate change, right? And a lot of what was shared in this presentation in terms of anxieties and stressors as a result of climate change, natural disasters. I'm really appreciative for Representative Tonko, Fitzpatrick, and Senator Markey for making this a priority within their legislative agenda. So within elements of the bill, if passed, the bill would establish such structures as grants with grants within the Center for Disease Control to create community-based programs that use a public health approach to building mental wellness structures. And it would also allow communities to build their own developmental and culturally appropriate strategies to enhance and sustain mental wellness structures. And so when we talk about one of our responses and how we might be able to respond as a faith community, our engagement and communication through our action alerts is one such way, and we'll continue to advocate for both pieces of legislation. But I wanted to highlight that we had a new one in support of the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act.
Thanks, Camille. for showing us how we can take action. So today's webinar is the third of 6 sessions. Later today, you will be receiving an email with a link to this webinar and resources that were mentioned, along with additional resources. I hope that you will join us tomorrow as we hear from Dr. Jeffrey Swanson as we look into mental health and gun violence. A sincere thank you again to Dr. Lewis and for Sherwin for speaking with us today. And thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Have a good day.